good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's been having a great day. I do recognize that for the second year in a row, I'm between you and drinks. So we're going to try and make this as engaging as possible at the end of a good day and before cocktails flow. But I think it's an important discussion to have, and I'm really thrilled to have Derron and Anne-Raphaëlle and Garry with me to talk about this. I mean, we're at the end of the day. You've been talking about this all day, but Arctic infrastructure and the need for it is, we've known it's been something that's been required, but now is at the forefront of our geopolitical circumstances. So I think if we can capitalize on that, we can really do some good things. I think though it does bring into question with all the needs, where does the money, it was a bit show me the money, I think, in the introduction, but it is going to require some innovative thinking about partnerships and financing. Just in terms of context, one of the most innovative and proven ways that of collaborating in the North on major projects has been public-private partnerships. For more than 20 plus years, P3s have proven pivotal in getting some really key projects off the ground in region in partnership with Indigenous communities and companies. Some examples of those projects include, the Mackenzie Valley Fiber Link, the Iqaluit International Airport, the Clecho All-Season Road. And P3s are adapting and evolving. We've got some tried and true approaches to P3s in the Canadian context. But as we are thinking through new asset classes and new opportunities, so too is the P3 industry in terms of evolving and adapting to give us opportunities to support industries like defense and energy in places where we maybe traditionally haven't been. So with that, maybe I'll just, by way of introduction for the panelists, and maybe Derron, I'll start with you. Maybe if I could ask each of you about sort of the role your organization plays in the North, and maybe what's top of mind for you. Maybe if there's things that are keeping you up at night, or whether that's for good reasons or bad.
Fair enough. Yes, so Concert Infrastructure is the primary investor and manager of the successful dual-use Iqaluit International Airport. It is one of 12 public-private partnerships in our portfolio. Those projects are situated across Canada. Our shareholders are 10 Canadian pension plans, so it's institutional capital. It's capital that is long-term, patient, and conservative. As you'll be aware, there's other forms of capital out there, but that's the nature of the capital behind Concert Infrastructure. And what's unique about the private capital, institutional capital that supports the majority of the Canadian P3 projects that have been successfully delivered is that unlike the large Canadian pension plans, the Maple 8, we take development and construction risk. And so that is really a differentiator in terms of when you're considering and looking at sources of capital to support the delivery of infrastructure in the Arctic. It's really who's prepared to take that type of risk. In terms of what's top of mind for us, without question, it's expertise and capacity to meet the challenge. And it's especially on the government and the counterparty side. So from our experience, resources expertise is often challenged. And then the second piece would be risk transfer, but I'll speak a little bit more in detail about that later. I think to Lisa's point, there is a track record of successful projects, P3 projects, to deliver infrastructure in the Arctic, and we should be looking at those as the example and for a sense of what the appropriate risk transfer would be. In terms of what I'm excited about, it's really the sheer scale, scope, and the impact from an economic, social, and sovereignty and defense perspective that the challenge in front of us presents. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Derron. Anne-Raphaëlle, how about you?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to do a sound check. Can you confirm you can hear me? Awesome.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to participate from Ranking Inlet, Nunavut here. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Nukik Corporation. Nukik Corporation is 100% Inuit owned and is overseeing energy and telecommunication infrastructure projects in the Kivalik region of Nunavut. We are mainly looking after a major nation building initiative that's called the Kivalik Hydro Fiber Link. Many people, I think, in the room have heard of the project, and I think several people in the room I'm actually working with on the project. So the project entails building the very first connection between Nunavut and the rest of Canada. It's a 1,200 kilometer transmission line paired with fiber optic capacity that would serve 5 communities in the Kivalik region of Nunavut and mines. So when we talk about infrastructure in the Arctic, I think the project is very much the embodiment of what we're all trying to achieve, which is to bring the North into the 21st century and finally give people access to services and critical infrastructure. I think maybe if I have one more minute here, just in terms of setting the stage, it's critical to understand that Nunavut is very unique. If we take the Yukon and NWT and consider them maybe to be 20, 30 years behind the rest of Canada in terms of access to infrastructure and infrastructure development, generally speaking, Nunavut is probably another 30 years behind these other 2 territories. And that's probably a euphemism because in most cases, there's a complete absence of said infrastructure. So we start from a place of really dire need that's paired with a huge sense of urgency. And in making sure that I paint the full picture here, I'd like to say as well that Nunavut is not only very large, it's 20% of Canada's landmass. I think it's been said already during your conference, but it also functions entirely on diesel. There's no optionality whatsoever built into the system. So it's quite unique again within the makeup of Canada. And compounding to that is the fact that none of the critical systems that support Nunavut in simply existing, be it energy or telecommunications, rest on domestic resources. So not only do we burn diesel, but it's not even Canadian diesel that we burn. For every single need of our daily lives, it's mostly US diesel. Most years it's 100% of all the petroleum products that come into Nunavut that are coming from the United States. And then as much as we like Starlink, because it's amazing technology, it's not Canadian technology. So there are 2 things to highlight. One is the infrastructure wall we're heading into as a huge national security problem. And number 2 is the fact that as much as we have projects in the hopper, no one has shovel in the ground right now. So what is the solution? How can we accelerate? And how can we finally provide solutions? And that's what's keeping me up at night.
Thanks. Garry, I mean, you wear multiple hats, so maybe talk a little bit about the role of your organization and maybe what's keeping you up at night or getting it, keeps you excited about the opportunity. Either one.
Well, Nukik, and thank you, and Ulukut, everybody. Whether it's an Inuk perspective or whether it's those who are now working in the Arctic for the first time, I think you read in the media, you probably have it shared with you when you meet Inuit that the North is a different place to do business, the Arctic archipelago, or Inuit Anangat. The day-to-day hat I wear as President CEO of Nunatsiavut group of companies in the Labrador area, fairly successful, relatively speaking, in our area, dabbling in aviation, owning part of an airline, but also working with mining partnerships in Voisey's Bay, doing real estate construction. That's what we do on the home front. So we have wholly owned majority as well as partnerships. On the national front, we're a member of the Inuit Development Corporation Association. I'm currently its national chair, and that is an awesome organization in that it represents the Dev Corps across Inuit and Anangat. And the level of cooperation and collaboration between partners, all the way from Inuvialuit across Nunavut, Nunavik into Nunatsiavut, is growing by the day. Some people may have heard of Nassituk in partnership. That is part of what we do under the Pan-Arctic Inuit Logistics in partnership with ATCO, a company called Nunatsiavut. But we operate and maintain the 46 north boarding radars across Canada. So we're already into that space of defense and security. We also won the contract to operate and maintain alert. So we have, if you will, experience in working with defense and security. The other part is we're damn good at infrastructure. We've lived in the North all our lives, and we've adapted, and we continue to adapt. But we've also learned how to cooperate with industry partners, large, medium, and small. So in terms of whether it's aviation or maritime, that's an area where we've built up a tremendous amount of capacity capability. Another part, obviously, that's important to us is the realization that there are significant socioeconomic challenges, whether it's food security, housing security, health security. We certainly do in our area, but also DevCorps across the north. We support nutrition north. We support access to healthcare. We support learning and education. That's fundamental to who we are as Inuit. So that, I would say, yes, partially it keeps me up at night because you can never do enough, but perhaps we can reimagine when we partner with the South and we look at something right now unprecedented. And, I'm a naval veteran. I've also worked with government. So over the last 40 years, I've never seen the level, the spark, and the interest of what we can do in the North together. And I've seen that in the previous panels as well. In fact, I would give a gold star to pretty well everybody who's been up on this platform today. A different, more informed, more effective conversation is occurring. The final thing I'd say is, notwithstanding best efforts, Inuit, perhaps the youngest population, I think our mean age is 25 years compared to the Canadian national average, 42. So we're a young population, but the young leadership in particular, and being inspired by the generations of experts, the elders, are approaching problems very differently. But then again, there are still some digital data issues and infrastructure that's critically missing or perhaps not as well positioned for all of us to not just understand, but to exploit the opportunities, like a tenfold increase in investments across the North in the next 10, 20 years. We're getting ready as DevCorps. We work at the very local level with community governments, the regional governments, the national, and indeed at this table and others, we have conversations with international partners. So yeah, it's most exciting. And so I think I'm more on the positive side than the risks this afternoon.
There's been a lot of talk about sort of the funding. We're here to talk about the financing because we know public funding can't meet the needs alone. And I think coming out of the federal budget in the fall, it was very clear that the government is looking to leverage private capital wherever it can to support its ambitious infrastructure agenda. So Anne-Raphaëlle, maybe I'll start with you. And where do you see the biggest opportunities for private and Indigenous capital to step in?
Yeah, thanks. And I think maybe I'll start by challenging that notion of, public funding can't support it all. If you allow me just to go back on that statement, just because if we take, maybe whole Inuit Nunangat and everything that everybody wants to do, which would be in the amount of, several billions of dollars, maybe that's a true statement. But if I take the Nunavut example and the 4 infrastructure projects that have been identified by the government of Nunavut and NTI, you're under 6 billion collectively for 4 projects that give you 2 deep sea ports, that give you access to the continental grid, access to the continental domestic fiber optic network, and access to local hydropower baseload generation in Nunavut's capital. So I just want to always go back on that notion that is very Canadian, by the way, that public funding cannot support large infrastructure plays in this country. Of course, it can't support everything everywhere, but I think in a territory that has seen almost no federal investment, And that hasn't seen certainly the degree of investment that's required to finally bring in within the societal and economic makeup of the country. I would argue that there's a huge place for public funding to play a very large role. And to that example, I want to use Greenland as an example, because it is astounding what's been done there. And it's been done decades ago. It's not new, but they have one of the most robust Arctic transmission and fiber network that exists out there. And there's almost little to no private merchant transmission investment. Infrastructure is viewed as an essential public service and as sovereignty infrastructure. So I think collectively, and I know there are some federal officials in the room, we also have to take that statement pretty responsibly and really understand what that says to Inuit people who have been used to assert sovereignty in the Arctic, and telling them that they're going to have skin in the game and that they're not going to be fully supported by the federal government in having access to very basic infrastructure, such as access to the grid and such as access to communications. But that aside, I will answer the question on what I see as an opportunity for private investment and Indigenous capital to partner. We are in the midst of those discussions. And I do think in many ways it is going to be our sweet spot, is going to be to leverage what the mining industry has already built and has very well built in the Arctic. They have the best level of expertise in infrastructure built out in the north, alongside defense. And so our best opportunities for partnership is really to leverage the lessons learned, the best practices, the infrastructure investments that have been made by those partners right in our backyard, and to use that to leverage private capital investment. But the final point I'll make is that where the chicken and egg game really gets played, and where it gets quite frustrating, honestly, for project proponents, is that the federal government doesn't move until everybody moves. And there has to be a recognition that the federal government galvanizes. Federal government nurtures those discussions and can really stimulate private investment. And so for Ottawa sometimes to not move until everybody moves, I think is where major projects actually go to die. And this is, I think some of the prior speakers spoke to the fact that we need to accelerate. The reason why many of those nation building projects have stopped at the concept idea or have been shelved after many years of being studied and invested in is for lack of federal action, because everybody else was at the table.
Thank you, and I agree. I think that convening, that collaborative approach, I think, is a theme we'll probably pick up on several times through the discussion. I mean, Derron, you're an investor. You're in the north. What makes Arctic projects challenging? Like, what are the conditions? I mean, I think there's been a lot of talk about, I think the previous panel talked about the Maple Eights. Where are they? Why aren't they there? What are the things, that need to exist to make them investable? And I do know that that's probably a different question for different types of investors, but at least from your perspective.
It is, and I kind of want to start at a macro level and pick up on some of the themes that Anne-Raphaëlle was getting at. And so 2 points from that perspective. One is, let's be honest, there's a lack of whole government and whole of Arctic regional strategy for infrastructure policy, a lack of prioritization of the projects themselves. And so, to Anne's point, that strategy and prioritization should also give an indication of where the capital is coming. So what are those projects that the federal government is going to fully fund through, through the public side, and what are those projects that require private capital, institutional capital, and what are those projects that, at the end of the day, we're looking to the private sector and industry to advance. And so really the federal government and the territorial governments need to get coordinated on this. And, from my perspective, there's a lot of good work and conversations happening, but it feels like they're happening in silos. The second point, and I referenced it earlier, is really, when we get to the implementation of projects, is the expertise and the capacity on the government side to run effective, efficient procurements and to, efficiently and effectively oversee the delivery of these infrastructure projects, especially in construction. We've seen over the last few years some real challenges in traditional government delivery of infrastructure, especially smaller infrastructure, let alone the large nation building projects that we have the ambition to deliver. And we could look at I would point to Nunavut 3000 housing and the challenges it's faced. The Rankin Inlet long-term care facility, it faced challenges. And again, as I said in my opening, we need to look at the examples of success. Lisa's referenced those specifically on the P3 side, and they can help guide that strategy and ensure that as we do move forward with these projects, that it's done in a way that's going to set us all up for success. And at the end of the day, why is this important? It's important to institutional capital again, because as I said in my opening remarks, we love certainty and stability. And so without that, we go to other jurisdictions that are providing the clear strategy, that have an efficient and effective agency or arm that is leading the delivery of infrastructure. So, before you even get into the micro of the specific projects, that's the macro overarching challenges that I see in the Arctic at this point.
I mean, there's been huge advances in terms of Indigenous participation in projects. We've got now, the federal government, in the Indigenous loan guarantee program and, equity stakes. So tell me a little bit, Garry, just from your experience and your view, I mean, it's central to Arctic projects. Indigenous-led development is key. So, how does Indigenous ownership change project outcomes?
I mean, that's a good question, because oftentimes people will look at it sideways and say, we're impediments oftentimes, or, you're dependent on government for this and that. But I'll take people back 50 years, the start of the modern land claims with Nukik in northern Quebec, and then it flowed through Nunavut and us in Nunatsiavut 20 years ago. That has not just inspired, but it's allowed growth in spaces that we've not been involved with before. Tom's here, and our connection with Voisey's Bay Mining allowed us to partner with the mining companies and allow a stream of funds that then permitted us to expand in different areas. So we have dabbled in aviation and maritime sea lift. We've gone into real estate, the fisheries, and things that make sense for us at a scale. We've also failed, and I think the fear of failure is dissipating. It's part of doing business. Not everything is successful, but we've diversified. Also, with some of these land claims, there was, there were access to capital and trust funds and such. So within, we were arm's length business entity from the Nunatsiavut government, but we have access to trust funds if indeed the assembly said it was an appropriate use of those monies. The other thing I think nationally as well now, it's the partnerships and the collaborations. The Eastern region in particular, I speak to colleagues up in the Kiktalk region or in Nukik. We're interested in working in bilateral or trilateral ways to leverage our expertise, whether it's in construction of key defense assets. And it's something I raised 2 days ago when I was with President Obed, and we were briefing the Senior Council, Armed Forces Council. And I said, we can do it differently. And certainly, one of the impediments, in fact, to the defense industry strategy that's about to be rolled out, it reimagines perhaps partnerships in a way that didn't exist 10 years ago. I'm buoyed by that, right? The other thing I'll say is, just looking at the dev corps across the Arctic right now, the six of us, it's 800 million plus in revenue each year. So we have capital, and we have access to not just private equity, venture capital, private debt, and the banks are more positive than they have been in our history, right? So all that's good. But we take steady, measured approach to new investments. kick the tires a fair bit, do a lot of our work, but slowly but surely I see that the capacity and the business acumen really rising amongst the various companies, large, medium, and small. So yeah, I'm way more positive and optimistic, I guess, than I would have been 5-10 years ago.
That's great. That's great to hear. And maybe Anne-Raphaëlle, just in terms of your experience, I mean, have you seen successful partnership models, or you've participated in where, you know, private and Indigenous capital have worked together really effectively?
I think it does, and I think we're certainly moving towards a world and a set of systems and tools in the toolkit that are going to really stimulate that kind of partnership. I go back to what I said earlier, is it's really a matrix that needs to involve the federal government, specifically in the Arctic, just because on the sheer base of population and per capita population, the economics are hard. And so you need to be able to defend a project beyond, certainly short-term economics, but also beyond current state of affairs. But look, I think we talked about mining, pardon me, but I think they are a key part of the equation. And in our backyard, in the Kivalik region of Nunavut, we've had excellent partnerships at different levels of governance. Certainly, the Kivalik Inuit Association, Sackco Investments Corporation. At my level, at Nukik Corporation, we've worked very well with Agnico Eagle Mines, Canada's largest gold miner, and they are an excellent partner. And we want them to stay in the territory for many more decades. And I think, this is where painting that long-term picture is critical, because those assets really enable so much in terms of, being able to build a transmission line, bringing fiber optic, that it is a critical enabler for multiple generations beyond the commissioning date. And so you have partners at the table that are willing to do a lot, and quite frankly, that are willing to do more than their main core business. And it needs to be recognized, because I think we're asking a lot of the mining industry in the Arctic, and they're there. They never say no. They just say, okay, show me the blueprint here and show me the economic regional plan, and I'll be a partner, because it's really hand in hand that we can, provide those solutions. So that's something that I've seen that has been very powerful, and that I think for us will be one of the way we crack the code on making the project happen and on bringing that type of critical infrastructure. And I'll name another. It's on the institution side of things, but it brings private capital. So I want to recognize the Canada Infrastructure Bank as well. And our experience with them has been very positive. They have guided us through a lot of question marks on our positioning in the project, and not everything is resolved. But my point being that you have institutions that work, right? Like you actually have within the Canadian set of options to build major projects. You have things that have been well designed, that have at their core mandate to supercharge infrastructure development. And so when you marry that kind of institutional knowledge with private capital, and then bring the momentum of nation building projects that are, like in our case, 100% Indigenous owned, I think you have an absolute recipe for success. And there should not be any reason why you cannot build those projects, especially linear assets that can be staged over time and that can be, built as far as as long as you want. And so I think this is going to be really what get those projects over the finish line, notwithstanding what I said earlier about the one with the federal government, of course.
Derron, I want to go back to something you commented on earlier in terms of the type of investor Concert is. I mean, there again, we recognize there's lots of different types of investors and different sort of views in terms of how they get involved. I mean, on the P3 side, the leveraging the private capital and expertise is a bit of an enabler for other things. We're looking at life cycle of the model, not just the build. We're looking at, leveraging innovation and efficiencies. And I'd say the big one is that risk transfer concept of, transferring the risk most, appropriate to handle it. And risk appetite is, it's big in terms of whether you choose to go into a project or not. So that can often be cited, that risk allocation can be cited as a bit of a barrier sometimes. So what are the risks I mean, what are the hardest risks for private capital to absorb in Arctic projects? And are there, how do you think through the sharing or whether they stay with government, but, where does that sort of sit?
Yeah, I guess in our experience, I mean, it's all manageable, but to your point, like there's obvious risks that somebody new to the Arctic or an outsider, obviously should be concerned about and focused on. I mean, things such as climate and environmental risk, supply logistics and lead times, material cost inflation, workforce planning. But from my perspective, like that's all an argument for why you want to marry up and partner experienced institutional P3 capital with local organizations such as Garry's and Anne-Raphaëlle's. Like that's just obvious to me, as to a strategy to manage and mitigate some of this risk. But I'd also say, in our experience, the government of Nunavut has worked very collaboratively and in a practical, reasonable way in terms of their management and application of the contract, right? So again, it takes that partnership and that collaborative approach, and we throw that around. It's a bit cliche, but these contracts are structured to really lean into partnership if you have the right values and partners at the table, and they can be very, very, very successful. And to your point, like at the end of the day, the institutional capital is about more than just the capital. It is about that integrated approach. It is about the expertise and the discipline that we bring to these projects.
Did that resonate with you, Garry?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Listen, I mean, most of the DevCorps, we exist to build wealth and trust. We are here to support local and regional capacities and capabilities. Heck, this conversation is a hard one when you go down to the community, the hamlet level, because you know what? We as Inuit have never been invited to the tables in the past. So this is somewhat foreign. And I proved that just a few months ago, and I was very fortunate in Atlantic Canada. I brought the 5 Canadian Division Commander and the lead for Atlantic Canada industry into a community called Hopedale to brief the Nunatsiavut Legislative Assembly, the elected members. It was the first time in our history. Mm-hmm. And we've had an 80-year history with the Canadian Forces and D&D. But it was the first time they went into that assembly and briefed the local leaders, and eyes were wide open. That is occurring across. It happened in Iqaluit, it's in Yellowknife, certainly in Nuvvuagittuq. So we're glad those conversations are starting, but they need to continue at all levels. The other part as well is the youth. I told you before, our average age or mean age is 25 years of age. So many, many young Inuit are coming through and are, in fact, leaders at a very young age. They have different perspectives. We're doing things through perhaps a generational lens that is somewhat experimental, because there is no, experience, critical mass of individuals who've been doing this for a long time. Even ourselves in current leadership positions are finding it quite interesting and quite exciting, but not always is your message either understood or heard. Okay, so realizing all of that, we just got to keep plugging away. Explore the opportunities, exploit the ones that make sense to us, while not losing touch of our own culture, our traditions, and our lands. Because the last thing we want to do is jump on board to this enormous economic engine and see environmental damage, or to see, a degradation in the lifestyle that we've enjoyed. And I think there's a happy coexistence there.
Yeah, it feels like we've come a long way from where duty to consult was a checkbox, and now there's actual partnerships and collaborative discussions starting from the beginning. So it's great to
Well, those modern land claims, you see, right? Now folks have the authority.
Yeah.
It's written in legislation.
Yeah.
You just can't come up and do what you want. There are tendering and procurement policies in each of the regions across. So even ourselves in Nunatsiavut, I wouldn't bother going into Iqaluit or working with our Saku colleagues and saying, hey, let's just nonchalantly carry on and come up with this partnership. You have to respect the rules within if you will. And those are established and they're now being enforced.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the message to partners. Absolutely open for business,
Yep.
but let's understand the ground rules.
Yep. Very important message. And Raphael, I'll turn to you again. I mean, energy security, you talked about diesel, earlier on, about energy security and transition projects, huge focus. Where do you see the strongest opportunities for private investment in northern energy infrastructure?
Yeah, and if you'll allow me, I'll take a step back just to, agree really with what's been said by Derron and Garry just now. But if you take a broader lens as well and look at the economic ecosystem in Nunavut right now, you really have something that speaks to the potential, but also that it has a lot of the founding block of an economy that's going to boom over the next few decades. But obviously, we need infrastructure because it has the potential, it has the population, it has the youth, and also it has that desire that thirst to really thrive. That is pretty unique to the Arctic. And so, if we take one of my shareholders, Saku Investments Corporation, it's 27 subsidiary companies, it's hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts and assets. It manages hundreds of employees, and it's not known down south that you have this kind of sophisticated entities that do day after day business in the Arctic and that are part of very important players such as Nunatsiavut that Garry was highlighting earlier. So I think, first of all, we need to educate, and we need to share that message that, yes, the North is far, it's remote, it's cold, but it is mature, it's ready for business. And again, as was said, it has to be done with a deep understanding of the governance structure, because you don't just come to the Arctic and say that you're going to build that project. More than likely, someone has thought about it before you did, and that person is probably with an Inuit Regional Association, an elected official, and has also tried to gather funding around that initiative. So there are lots of good things where private capital can actually get behind and nurture initiatives that are already underway. But to answer your more pointed question on energy, I'll go back to the fact that for our project, we have the anchor customer. We are in very detailed discussion with the territorial utility, Nukik Energy Corporation, and they understand their role as the only, legal retailer of power in the territory. And so they have those discussions with the mining sector on the offtake agreement that would be necessary for the project. And that's where those dynamics between public sector and private capital can really gather, because you have fairly de-risked project, right? Like utilities are AAA tenants. That's the best articulation of a business case that you could have. And private capital loves that. They're attracted to that. But what scares them is, when am I going to get my money back? And are you going to continue to have said anchor tenant? And so we need to be able to really think about that in a long-term framing where it becomes an amortized asset over multiple decades. And infrastructure is one of the best investment you could make, because you're never going to regret building a power line into the Arctic or building a road or building a port. Those are absolute critical sovereign pieces of infrastructure that you can actually deliver for your people.
Derron, we're talking a lot about energy. I mean, we've got the Major Projects Office, and I know it's been referenced quite a bit, but, they're advancing nation-building projects. But nation building doesn't have an exact definition. So what would you say government needs to consider when they're looking at nation-building projects in the Arctic?
Yeah, I mean, there has been a lot of talk about nation-building projects today in the Major Projects Office. I thought the minister from the territories did a great job kind of walking through, which ones are on the list and aren't on the list. And I think that's clear. Like, it's pretty clear. Like, there's projects on the list. There's another tranche that, is under consideration, under development. But beyond that, like, to me, you have to then give you have to give serious consideration to the sheer resources and capacity of delivering on all of these priorities, right? Like, there can't be 25 major projects in the Arctic delivered simultaneously or within any kind of reasonable period of time. So it takes, again, back to the strategy and the planning and the the prioritization, like that needs to be in place. Beyond this, like it's reasonable to believe that, as the Commodore talked about on the panel, like there's a tranche of D&D led projects that are likely to come out. Sean Boyd referenced, that's great. We've got the major projects, we've got the D&D, but there's a whole enabling set of infrastructure, water, wastewater, roads, hydro, social services that needs to be in place, housing, to support the delivery of any of this, major project and initiative. So, like, again, this all leads you back to, like, we collectively need that strategy and that plan and the policies and clarity on prioritization of projects so that we can focus our resources and energy to helping make this successful. I mean, beyond that too, you've got, I think consideration for defense tech and like new technology, and like that's emerging as we sit here today. You've got Canadian companies like Dominion Dynamics, Kraken in St. John's, Cellular Robotics in Vancouver, all developing, and in the case of the last two, like autonomous submarines. And so how does that fit with traditional D&D platforms, fighter jets, submarines, and what's the infrastructure that's required to support that type of an approach? So, a lot of complicated moving pieces, but again, I would advocate for us collectively to, push for a clear strategy and prioritization.
And I think it's an important point too, because that was a laundry list of asset classes and needs that you've got. And that's just, we've also then got assets happening down in the south across the country as well too that are required. So you've got labor supply chain issues, all of that's going to come into play as well too. So that strategy would, I would think would be helpful for many. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, and Anne-Raphaëlle, maybe I'll start with you about sort of dual use or multi-purpose infrastructure. From your perspective, how do we ensure that infrastructure investment delivers those lasting local benefits and not just sort of the project construction activity?
Thanks. Yeah, and I'm glad I didn't get the question on the major project office before, but I have to say it wouldn't have been overwhelmingly positive. But maybe that's for another time. So yeah, look, I mean, we talk about the cost benefit analysis and the full value proposition of the project pretty much daily. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of understanding a project really for the multi-decades that it's going to be in existence. But, the benefits during construction are very significant. So I want to state them just for people to really realize what we're talking about. It would be more than $3 billion contributed to the gross domestic product of the country during construction alone, and more than 15,000 person years of employment. So we're really talking about a major project constructed over 4 years. But beyond that, and that's what I always reflect on, the Kivalliq Hydro Fiber Link is really not an energy project. It's at its core an infrastructure project. And when you say that, it kind of removes the climate change and the diesel argument, which are very important in and of themselves. We have to do something about this. But I think removing that from the equation just allows people to focus on what this is going to do to people's lives. What is it going to do to people's businesses? What is it going to do for telehealth? What is it going to do for enabling remote education? As of this morning, we know that there's a university that's going to be based in Arviat. Arviat is only 300 kilometers away from Churchill. Let's connect those communities. The Kivalliq Hydro Fiber Link would provide baseload electricity to that Inuit and Nangat University, and it would also factor into, by the way, a housing factory that's being built in Arviat. There are lots of things happening that can only reach their full potential with this kind of backbone infrastructure. And so this is why my board, myself, we continue to fight for the vision of being connected to the rest of Canada, because yes, it has that sentimental value of finally being part of the nation. But beyond that, we know that you cannot have a thriving society that functions on diesel. you cannot reach your full potential if you rely on low orbiting satellites only. You have to have terrestrial domestic assets, and you have to have scalable infrastructure. And the best way to do that is to really invest in those linear pieces of infrastructure that deliver for generations to come.
Garry, how about from your perspective in terms of, ensuring that lasting local benefit?
Well, that's key though, isn't it? Really. And we think, not just D&D, but Canada is serious about long-term investments. And I think Inuit got specifically what's in the art of the possible, effective sort of Arctic connectivity that is built and then sustained over time. And that includes, the maritime, the aviation, as well as the digital infrastructure. Nothing worse than doing, trying to work at the speed of dial-up, right? We need something modern. And as quick as that can come into the north and across the north, all the better. Energy security, for sure. We're talking to small and nuclear folks right now. As I said earlier, we manage the 46 North Warning radar systems. 10 are manned, but also there's alert. All the hamlets as well. 10 years ago, that the small end nuclear would have been a very different conversation. Today, up against the cost of diesel and the pollution and all the rest of it, way more receptivity. So we're having those conversations, both with respect to Nunatsiavut and North Warning, as well as some of the other hamlets, which in and of itself exceeds the capacity needed to power the community and gives additional growth opportunities. So that's kind of cool. The other one obviously is, as we move forward on this, are we adequately addressing housing and health security and food security?
Yeah.
And I think we can, right? Through the provision of long, sustainable and well-paying jobs, but also so that they can remain in community and build the capacity and the resiliency. An example I used a little while ago is GoTenna 19. It's a company in Ottawa, military, dual use, multi-use, but it's handheld telecommunication devices, in fact, used by special forces around the world. We've experimented a bit with that up in the Inuit area. There's my partner in the Kikitalik Corp is going to partner. We're looking at it in Nunatsiavut. But you know what the important part for us? That could help build up the community resiliency for ground search and rescue. And Yvonne knows as well as all of us, that's something we need to close the gap on fast. So if we can leverage military technology to assist in a civic, role or commercial role, all the better. Small energy systems, we've talked to the Danes and the Icelandic groups. They have Arctic small windmills that is specific for minus 20, minus 30, minus 40. They may not power the entire community, but they can power a couple of hockey rinks. They can power a small area to support tourism. So these are the areas that we're exploring in real ways, and but a big focus. And I think it was said before, at the same time we're doing all this, how are we building up the learning and the development for the youth? How do we sustain that, right? Yeah. So those young graduates, regardless of the trade or profession they follow, they can reap the successes and build even better in the future. Because otherwise, this will all be for naught.
Yeah. And you talked about it a little bit, but in what role do you think the development corporations actually have in shaping the project pipeline?
So, in fact, we represent each of the critical areas across Inuit and Nunga. We are arm's length. We're not government, but we work at arm's length. We are the business arms of the respective regional governments. We understand, we live in those areas. We are supported by the governments. We have that ability as well to pivot to industry because we run our own companies, either wholly owned or majority or in partnership, like I said, across the Arctic, like Nunatsiavut. So we feel that we have a complementary role, not quite government, but certainly within the business realm, to continue to explore and exploit the opportunities, to pool our resources, to have a go at it either within our respective area or, for example, the whole of the Atlantic. I'll talk fisheries for a minute. You know, lots of shrimp and turbot and cod. And there's some of our colleagues who are buying into vessels. They cost about $100 million. That's a chunk of change, right? But if we do it together, we can increase our access to quota and these kinds of things. So it's having those open mind conversations, working with governments at all levels repeatedly, and making sure, I think most importantly, that the community members, the leaders, understand what's going on in the conversation. Not talking over their heads, but talking with and building the respect, right? Because that's where it's powerful. You get a lot of feedback, whether it's from the elders, whether it's from the leadership, whether it's from the youth. Because at the end of the day, we live in these communities that may be remote or isolated, but we care, and we want to make sure that we have sustainable prosperity, and we look after the land and the traditions that we hold dear.
Derron, I want to come back to you for a minute, because, I mean, we've talked a lot, you and I, the broader investor community that are members of the council. I mean, investor confidence and investment depends on certainty. So what policy or regulatory, and I feel a little bit like I might know what the answer is, but what changes would you see would most improve investor confidence in Arctic infrastructure?
Yeah, I think I've referenced it several times. I'll reference it one more. I mean, I think it is really that whole of government, meaning federal and territorial, and whole of Arctic strategy and plan for infrastructure. Infrastructure that includes clear identification of the priority nation building projects, clear identification of DND's priorities and its projects, clear identification of the enabling social and civil infrastructure to support those projects and the workers. And then fourth, those priorities that kind of fall into that dual use bucket. So, I think that's really what we need. And, on that point, not to steal Jessica's thunder for tomorrow, but Concert and others in the room are stepping up to provide funding and support on an initiative that will start to get at some of this. It won't provide the full strategy, but maybe it will bring attention and some information to the table to help with that. So I think more on that tomorrow.
I look forward to hearing more about that. Garry, maybe I'll come back to you, and looking ahead and your future sort of view of things 10 years from now.
Oh, that's a long ways.
But what does 10 years from now, what does success look like for Arctic infrastructure development?
Much as I shared previously, we're hooked in to the conversations across the country. We're hooked into the world of possibilities by having capital, by having access to investments, to allow us to do things at the speed and scale needed, right, to move communities forward. We also want to ensure that what it is we're doing through businesses, DevCorps, economic development opportunities, is relatable to the communities that we serve. Our company is owned 100% by the Inuit beneficiaries. We have great jobs and all the rest of it. We reinvest back into profitable businesses. Sometimes they don't work, like we thought, but we try and reduce and mitigate. But we want to make sure that we have better than a critical core of very competent young Inuit women and men who are coming up and wanting to take this over, who have leadership roles in other places, right? Key infrastructure, we talked all about that for sure. So let's take advantage of whatever national defense needs may be in the aviation, marine, land sectors, and look at whether there's multi-use application and support, right? A port can support Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Navy, fisheries, DFO, also security, RCMP, and our fisheries fleets as well, right? All of that is very useful. And there's a growing commercial, for example, footprint across the north right now with cruise ships and things, right? So we're mindful. But I think the other core part that I'll say, you know, if I look downstream in 10 years' time, is that we're connected. And we have those critical community infrastructure pieces in place, and that they're effectively being used, and we're supporting the well-being of community members across the entire coast.
Anne-Raphaëlle, what about for you in 10 years' time? What does success look like?
Yeah, in 10 years' time, we'll have built the project. So that would be success in and of itself, commissioning by 2032. I think exactly what Garry said, you know, thriving communities in a thriving environment, respectful of traditions, respectful of the culture, which is an amazing thing that we want to preserve for all of us here in Nunatsiavut who have a chance to live and experience this culture and be a part of it. And I think just really thinking about the next generation and not getting too ahead of the skis, but also having that foresight and that bold vision that, again, it's not because it's cold and far and remote and small communities that people don't deserve the same type of infrastructure. So in 10 years, I think it's attainable. In many ways, it's a low-hanging fruit to do a lot of what we're talking about. The only thing that's in the way is a bit of a Canadian mental block that really has been plaguing infrastructure development in the Arctic.
Derron, you're already doing some stuff up in the north. Do you guys think about what success looks like from your perspective?
I mean, for sure. I mean, you know, it's clearly, you know, in the infrastructure space, in the P3 world, you know, we talk about, or we focus, you know, a lot on bricks and mortar, building the infrastructure, the dollars and cents. But at the end of the day, it really is about the services that infrastructure supports, right? And how that infrastructure and those services strengthen the community through better or strengthened economic and social prosperity. And in the case of the Arctic, you've also got that piece on sovereignty. So like that is what it's about. And certainly like that's what gives me purpose and motivates me day in and day out, you know, when we're engaged in Iqaluit with the airport or with any of our infrastructure assets across Canada. Like that is the real value and impact of what we're doing and why it's so important.
Do you have any advice to other investors that might be looking to get involved up north?
That's my competitive advantage. I'm just kidding. No, I think it's pretty, I mean, I think there's themes that have run through all of our comments and observations here today. But, you know, I think first and foremost, it's knowledge. So like literally and figuratively know the ground. Second, it's about relationships, right? And that's the value and the importance of the Indigenous partnerships, both in terms of investment and the development and management activity. You know, I've engaged a fair bit with my good friend Clint Davis, especially when he was leading Nunasi. And, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, potential partnerships and what it meant. And it was about much more than just co-investment. It was about capacity building, knowledge transfer, expertise, development of the local Inuit. And as I said to him, I said, like, you know, I'm looking at this realistically. Like the idea is that I'm putting myself out of business eventually, right? So we're partnering, we're transferring capacity, knowledge. You know, that's required on project 1, 2, 3. But when you start getting to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like the local Inuit can probably then take on the challenges on their own. And that's part of the objective in my eyes.
So there's more than just the rate of return for the
Absolutely.
private capital to be thinking about. It's good advice. I have one additional question for each of the panelists myself, but I'll pause here and just see if there's anybody, any questions from the floor. And I think there are some roving microphones somewhere. Oh, I see a hand over there.
I was good. Can you hear me? Yeah. I was going to try to use my big girl voice too, but I always get mad when people don't use the mic. I wanted to ask you for your advice because one of the things we talk about innovation, we talk about partnering. The minister earlier spoke about hope, and but one of the things that I think is preventing us from being agile is really there's this dearth of individuals between this level and the next generation that have not done this before, that have not done nation building, and they're really stuck to their business processes. There's a kind of a resistance to moving faster. And at the same time, we need to build this leadership capacity. Garry, you had mentioned it with the young people in the community. But we're trying to fly the plane as we're building it, like we say. How do you do that with your leaders and the people that have to come along with us? Because, like, I'm going to retire in a few years. So how do we get these folks along with us at the same time?
I can lean on my experience at, I spent 10 years in the Ontario government and sort of was at the forefront of the establishment, the initiation of Infrastructure Ontario. And, you know, it was very much a new strategy, a new model. And we had to basically turn the existing bureaucracy and government around and open their eyes in terms of, you know, how infrastructure was going to be delivered. You know, fundamentally, from my perspective, I was having this conversation with somebody a couple of days ago. Like, it really takes a political champion to drive this. It takes a ministers, premiers, prime ministers to really be committed to a strategy. I mean, we don't have a strategy, so how can they be committed? A strategy and a policy, and like, in my experience, that's laid the groundwork and the conditions for success. And again, you see that in other provincial jurisdictions, Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia. They all have dedicated, integrated infrastructure agencies or departments that take a whole of government perspective and have the responsibility, authority, and autonomy to deliver on that mandate that they've been given by government, i.e., their ministers and premiers and prime ministers. And so, like, to me, without that, you're fighting an uphill battle. You really are.
Yeah. I mean, I think the experience we've seen, especially in the P3 space, that political champion then finds the officials who then also get on board. And then it just sort of, you know, because the political champions in Ontario, when you were there, would not have been successful if guys like you weren't willing to actually implement the change, right? So you need the champions almost at both levels, right? At the project, you know, public owner level as well as the political, that can help sort of have that culture shift. And I think that's, you know, Canada has a 30-year history in the P3 space, and I think that's why we've been successful, is we've been able to build sort of those units, I think.
But D&D too is uniquely challenged because of your postings and your, you know, every 2 to 3 years you've got people moving chairs, and so that can be a challenge at the kind of implementation level for sure. And I've seen that as well.
Yeah. I was reminded when you were saying that 6 years ago, I was Director General in Indigenous Services Canada, looking after First Nation Inuit Health for Ontario. So I'm ex-military. The guy on my left for the Ontario government, General Hillier, who some may know. And
I think maybe some of us.
but you know what was funny about that? In Ontario, it's a bit of a mess sometimes, healthcare in general. But what that whole process through the pandemic taught me was that you've got to find a common way to have difficult conversations. Don't forget, as this whole thing was unwinding, and there was a certain scare, especially amongst First Nation Inuit populations, that, you know, things like vaccines weren't always popular. They were forced on people, right? But it took all levels, whether it was government, local leaders, health officials, professionals, people who were brand new into the industry or the space, like General Hillier and myself, to find common ground to have the conversations. No different than right now. And like I said earlier, not every community has the same level of understanding. Build those bridges, make it happen. Like, how is this supporting defense and security across the country? How is that supporting resiliency in communities and making it better for each and every individual? Trying to find the common ground, really hard sometimes, takes a lot of patience, but don't give up.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't, and Anne-Raphaëlle, I don't want to leave you out if you wanted to jump in.
No, I mean, I would be repeating what those gentlemen have said. I fully agree. You have to have a champion, and at the end of the day, it's, you know, you have to believe in that vision and believe in the potential. So I'll leave it at that.
I think too, just to, again, I'm not one of the panelists here, but just to jump in, like, I mean, I think there are, depending on what you're trying to communicate, there are organizations out there that, you know, can help. I mean, my organization in particular, we do a lot of work on trying to explain to folks what the benefits of private finance are, rather than just money into a project. So I think, you know, and Jessica and Arctic 360, I mean, I think there are lots of organizations you can tap into that can help with that education process as well too, depending on what it is that you're, you know, that you're struggling with. So I would definitely encourage, I mean, we're not the only ones, there's other organizations out there, but you definitely can, you know, can help with that as well. You can ask a question, Jessica, go ahead.
Yes, we need an infrastructure investment strategy. Derron, where do you see that sitting? So is it in the PMO's office? Is it like where? Like somebody has to be in charge, right? Somebody has to lead and decide that this is what. And investment strategies are. Countries do them, regions do them. You know, this is not something new or novel. They're like pretty much commonplace.
Yeah, it's not. I think the unique thing with the Arctic is you need, as I alluded to, you need an integrated federal and territorial strategy and engagement. I haven't thought through how that translates organizationally, but you know, I would say this. I would say in my experience over 25 plus years in infrastructure on both the government and private sector side, I think I alluded to it in my last answer, like the key for success is a dedicated, responsible agency, organization, department. That last existed from my perspective in the federal government pre-2015 through P3 Canada. I'm not advocating for a strict P3 agency, but that agency had responsibility to take a cross-government perspective on infrastructure investment and delivery. It resulted in, well, it was partly a factor in the Iqaluit Airport project. They supported that project. Lisa was in that organization. She can speak to it probably better than I, but like, to me, that's what it takes. When I engage with the federal government today, it's very disparate, whether it's Arctic or whether it's opportunities in the South. It's very disparate. There's not a whole of government perspective or strategy for their own infrastructure. So
It's true.
I think, you know, just again, where we've been advocating for a centralized hub for quite some time at the council. We've never been, you know, we've never gone forward with it. It needs to be this organization housed in this place. I think the machinery of government, there's an element of government can kind of figure that out. You just, you know, to Derron's point, if you don't have that, where do people go? Like, it would be great if we had a bit of a one-stop shop for people looking to get in. I think, you know, if you were to think about it, I mean, the major projects office reports up through PCO. You know, but, you know, so there's an element of centralization already there with at least the MPO and then other agencies and organizations involved. But I think leadership from the top in terms of strategy development would be, you know, putting my old political hat on, I would say is definitely a, you know, a place to start.
And it may be contentious. I'm a firm advocate of, you know, partly to the earlier question about resistance and obstacles in government, like, you know, from my perspective and experience, like PSPC is one of those obstacles and challenges in terms of federal infrastructure delivery.
Yeah.
Can I add something quickly here, folks, just on the question that was asked? Because I think we need to recognize that Nunavut has made extraordinary efforts recently to align. And so that alignment between and amongst the territory has been done. Last year, NTI and the government of Nunavut released their Arctic security strategy, and it identifies priorities. It identifies nation-building projects. So from where we sit, the ball is really in the federal court. And we are being talked about self-determination, but the federal government tends to use it when it's convenient, but when it comes to actually making important decisions on projects that have been self-determined to be important and have been prioritized, then this is where the puck doesn't get in the net. And so I think I wish we didn't need the federal government the way we need to, and the way we need them for those nation building projects. But the reality is we do. But there is a bit of a lack of accountability on both the speed at which those projects are done, and also that the goalposts are constantly changing. And so this is why those projects are not getting done, because you're being given some piece of homework on Monday, and then on Friday, they say, thank you very much, but here is another list. And by the way, it's contradictory to what we asked you to do on Monday. And so how are project proponents supposed to even progress in that ecosystem? And that there has to be some accountability. And the MPO is not doing that. It's adding a layer of bureaucracy onto an existing layer of bureaucracy. So let's do better.
Yeah, great. I think there's one more question.
Hello there. My name is Dario Batista. I'm a high school student at Toronto French School here in Toronto. My question for you is, a lot of Arctic infrastructure requires patient capital. Are today's capital markets structured to support these 10, 20, 30-year long projects? And if not, what steps need to be taken to ensure that they are? Thank you.
You want to take that one, Derron?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure investment market in Canada it's evolved a fair bit. You know, from call it 2005 to where we sit today. You know, if I could quickly characterize, in 2005, you had an emerging market, new models. You had international experience in terms of P3 infrastructure investment. You had Canadian companies trying to learn the model and the approach. So you had a combination of, you know, pure private capital and some Canadian institutional, and then on the equity side, and then on the debt side, you had the full spectrum from capital markets to bank financing to institutional debt. Over that period of time, the market's evolved. A lot of international players have pulled from the market. I think, you know, by and large, recognizing that the experience, the relationships that Canadian equity, institutional capital had in Canada with governments, the alignment, long-term patient capital with government objectives over the long term, like there was just a stronger alignment. They were challenged to be competitive in that environment. Likewise, almost exclusively now, we are going to institutional debt to support the debt financing for the project. So there's very little engagement of capital markets to support these P3 infrastructure projects today. The larger ones, the nation building, maybe, like that might require capital market support, but you know, it's a fairly well-developed financing market, both on the equity side and the debt side in Canada. You know, there's never been a situation where capital's constrained, either equity or debt, that I can recall or point to. I don't know, Lisa, from your perspective, but you know, we really do have a strong market for infrastructure development and investment in Canada, and lots of experience, expertise, and capacity.
Yeah. Great. I did have one more question. We are over time, so and again, we are standing between folks and cocktails. But my last question was around, is there one thing you could change? But I feel like we've answered that. And I don't want to put words in everybody's mouth, but that strategy seems to stick out most to me in terms of this conversation. So I think
Strategy and leadership,
And-
like whole of government, like leadership, clarity for me.
Go ahead, Garry.
Just-
Final words.
It's just reimagining. Don't be caught up with the way things were.
Yeah.
Be entirely open-minded. There are innovative, smart approaches from people who aren't embedded in this work, who have wonderful ideas. That's why I go to high schools on a regular basis. Brilliant, because they have no knowledge of what you're trying to do, but they have super great ideas that we can operationalize and put into practice. So that's kind of, you don't need to be an expert in the field to have great ideas.
No. Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, guys. It was great chatting.